I guess you were mentioning that justice wasn't blind, and you were talking about like the disparity between status as a modifier in terms of like the reputational restitution. Was there any other ways in which it wasn't blind? Or maybe another question would be, what were the problems? Like, we've talked about a lot of kind of the cool things that the way this worked without a central authority, but I'm sure there were ways in which it didn't function well. What might have been some of those?
Yeah. Well, we had the example of the copyright case that devolved into into bloodshed. Into
war.
Into war.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, like these, I look at the legal manuscripts not so much as describing society as it actually was, but it was more aspirational. Like, if everything was perfect and everything was ideal, this would be the order of things in society. And there was a lot of things that we would say are wrong with it. And I can give you a couple of examples. One of the main ones is that the people of a higher status, their testimony was given a higher weight. So if it was a noble person testifying in a case on behalf of somebody, they might not even have been the plaintiff or the defendant, but if they're like vouching for somebody, well, their testimony is always going to be given more weight than the other guy, right? And the other guy might need to get 2 or 3 or 4 or more of his relatives to accumulate an equal amount of status that could then balance against the testimony of the noble, let's say. So that was a part of another way that justice wasn't blind, is that it gave a higher value to the testimony of people of a higher status. And then obviously, like, we have to talk about the status of women, because when people do a cursory glance at Brehon Law, they always say, oh, the status of women was so great, women had these rights. And yeah, by comparison to other continental systems at the time, but by comparison to today, maybe not so much. Like, so that the wife's testimony was never really given a woman's testimony was never really given value in court, except for a couple of things, like her testimony as to the father, like in childbirth, the paternity. That was something that they said. So there was always a funny phrase, was like, sure, only the woman would know who the father is, sort of thing. So testimonies of that nature. Testimonies on deathbed was always given weight regardless of who it was. So a deathbed confession and that's still, the case today. We tend to take deathbed confessions seriously. But in society, well, let me tease that out a bit more, because I'm kind of oversimplifying it. In normal circumstances, a woman's status was tied directly to that of the closest male. So if she was not married, it would be her father. And when she interacts in society, she's kind of operating on her father's name and her father's like insurance. And if she was to commit a crime, or somebody had committed a crime against her, it was the father who would be the man who would stand in the case. And obviously today we know that like that wouldn't work, right? However, if that woman, through her own skill, and like there was no preclusion from women to become educated or to become a poetess, or we have records of female doctors and physicians and things like that.
What about Brehons? Brehons?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brehons, yeah.
Brehon.
We don't have like I have not come across like direct stories that say that there was women Brehons. But there's nothing in the laws to suggest that they would have been precluded. We also have to factor in that these were written by men who were of the church, and you can see a noticeable decline in the status of women as the church increases over history. So the further back we go, the more powerful women we see, and women are given this very high status in our early Ireland. The land was always considered to be feminine, and Ireland comes from Era, which is a female goddess. So there was, if you go back far enough, the women and the feminine were held in a very high regard. And I can hear there's probably feminists today would hear what I'm saying and their blood would be boiling. But it was done for protection, because it was a brutal society as well. There was no like, if you were a woman by yourself and you didn't have a man to protect you, well, then you can probably imagine what could happen in those circumstances. So the men were there to protect their women. And so if it wasn't the father, then it would be the husband. However, and this is important, if she rose in her own status on her own name, and her status was higher than that of her husband's, then she operated in society on her own status. So if she educated herself or became wealthy, they could own property. They kept the property that they brought to the marriage. A woman could divorce her husband on several grounds. They could choose their partner. Even the earliest mythological accounts we have are stories of women taking their husband to court, and the judge ruling in favor of the woman. So there's a lot in the early mythologies to suggest that women had a high status, and where they didn't, it was done from a social protection point of view. But still, we might have issues with that sort of a approach today. And connected to that is the concept of slavery. So although cattle was the main unit of currency, the measure, so like dollars and cents, one of them was called a shade, and the other one was a cool. And a cool was a female slave. So the value of a female slave was like a unit of currency. If it was like, I think 14 cows, something like that, maybe it was 7, doesn't matter. It was a certain set number of cows, which was called a cool, which was a female slave. It's not, when we say slavery, it's not the slavery of the modern era or the recent modern era, you know, of complete ownership of a human being. It was more like indentured servitude. And there was slavery in that sense, was absolutely a part of Irish society, which is something that wasn't great, okay? But the opposite was, it was like this. Let's say you had become dishonorable, you'd committed crime in your own clan, and your clan disowned you, okay? Because that was a consequence of not following the law, or that you didn't pay your fine. You could be outcasted. So you become an outcast, and you leave your home territory, and you go to the next territory over. If somebody didn't take you in and say, right, you can come and work on my land, you're probably going to be killed. You're probably going to die. You're probably going to be eaten by wolves or something like that. So the slavery, I wish I had a better word for it, because it's so loaded, and there's a lot of issues with the idea of slavery, and rightly so. For I'm thinking of American history here. It conjures up minds that, like, ideas that can turn your stomach to think that humans would treat other humans like that. That's not what I'm talking about here. It was more like a kind of a social welfare again, where if you couldn't afford to look after yourself, or you couldn't afford to take care of yourself, and somebody else agreed to take care of you, you owed that person labor, you owed that person loyalty, and that was the type of kind of indentured servitude. But in the same way, you could actually earn your freedom, you could buy your freedom over a certain amount of time. You could actually become a free man of a lower class, a lower grade, and operate again as a non-indentured servant.
I like to be annoyingly precise because I guess I'm a philosophy nerd. So I really want to tease through this, because what you described in the second part didn't sound like slavery. Like if you approach a noble and request to be taken in and taken care of and fed in exchange for work, that sounds like a job. So what am I missing? What part of that changes it into indentured servitude? Like, can I not leave? Is that it? Or
well, I guess you would not be able to leave until you had like paid off what you owed, and there would be some sort of but that's just one like way of looking at the slavery back then. Like, let's remember that St. Patrick was brought to Ireland as a slave. Okay. There was slave trade going on. Irish were going over to the Western Isles of Britain, even France, and so on, and there was taking slaves back. But I think so those people were slaves. They weren't necessarily going because they needed a job, but they would have been forced to work. However, from the records, it seems that they would have been treated reasonably well, like as if they were indentured servants on their land. But I don't want to kind of look at this with rose-colored glasses. As I said, it was a it was a brutish society. All over the world was brutish, you know, at that in that era, and it was really Christianity that softened these people and gave them a sense of maybe a conscience, the idea of like getting to heaven or going to hell, and that there was consequences for their behaviors. That would have altered over time their view of how they treated other people, how they treated slaves, and so on.